mad scientist.
You know me?
And about your work.
My work?
Robert!
The Omega Man, a title that perfectly captures the existential isolation at the heart of this 1971 apocalyptic vision. As Charlton Heston's convertible cruises through the deserted streets of Los Angeles, the camera lingers on a world frozen in time. Newspapers announcing a biological disaster blow across empty intersections. Mannequins stand as silent witnesses in department store windows. And the only sound is the haunting echo of Heston's voice as he plays chess against himself and talks to people who no longer exist. In the twilight years of the Vietnam War, as public trust in government institutions crumbled and environmental concerns gained mainstream attention, the Omega Man emerged as a stark warning about humanity's capacity for self-destruction. This second adaptation of Richard Matheson's influential novel, I Am Legend, arrived during science fiction's pivot from space exploration to earthbound anxieties, capturing the paranoia and social fractures of its era with surprising clarity. Produced on a lean $2 million budget and grossing $8.7 million domestically, the film overcame its financial constraints through creative location shooting and the commanding presence of its leading man. While not an immediate box office sensation, it would eventually become one of the defining cult classics of 1970s science fiction. What makes the Omega Man still resonate today isn't just its apocalyptic imagery, but its exploration of profound questions about survival, purpose, and what remains of humanity when civilization collapses. This isn't merely a story about one man's fight against mutated plague survivors. It's about the search for meaning in a world where all the old rules have vanished, and the desperate need to create something new from the ashes of what came before. Let's dig into what makes the Omega Man such a fascinating piece of filmmaking. One of the things that blew me away when I first saw this movie was how they managed to create those eerily empty Los Angeles streets. Remember, this was 1971. No CGI, no digital removal of people or cars. Director Boris Sagal and his team had to get creative, filming early Sunday mornings when downtown LA was practically deserted. They'd block off a few streets at a time, and Charlton Heston would cruise through in that iconic red convertible while the camera captured a post-apocalyptic world that was actually just clever scheduling. The visual style of the film really stands out too. There's this stark contrast between the harsh, overexposed daylight scenes where Neville rules the city and those creepy night sequences where the pale, hooded family members emerge from the shadows. Cinematographer Russell Meddy, who won an Oscar for Spartacus, by the way, used these dramatic lighting differences to show us two completely different worlds existing in the same space. The daytime scenes feel almost bleached out, emphasizing Neville's isolation, while the night scenes have this gothic, almost religious quality with lots of candlelight and shadows. Something not many people talk about is the film's soundtrack. Ron Grainer's score shifts between jazzy, upbeat themes for Neville's daytime activities and these unsettling, almost choral arrangements for the night scenes. It's disorienting in the best way possible. The production faced some pretty tough challenges too. Finding enough abandoned-looking locations in a busy city was a constant headache. For some scenes, they had to completely redress parts of downtown LA, covering modern storefronts with debris and abandoned vehicles. The team even had trouble with the plague victims' makeup. They wanted something between zombie and albino, and it took weeks of testing to get that pale, veiny look just right. What's really impressive is how they pulled all this off on such a limited budget. Sagal came from television directing, where you learn to work fast and efficiently. He brought that same mentality to the Omega Man, often getting scenes in just a few takes and making creative use of existing locations rather than building expensive sets. The apartment where Neville lives was actually a real penthouse they rented for the shoot. They just modified it with all those defense mechanisms and the cool 70s furniture. When you watch it now, some of the effects might seem a bit dated, but there's something so much more authentic about these practical solutions than today's CGI apocalypses. You can feel the emptiness of those streets because they were actually empty, not created in a computer. That authenticity gives the Omega Man a raw power that many modern disaster films just can't match. The heart and soul of the Omega Man isn't just its apocalyptic setting, it's the characters who inhabit this broken world, brought to life by some truly memorable performances. Let's start with the legendary Charlton Heston. Fresh off his success in Planet of the Apes, Heston brings that same commanding presence to Robert Neville. But what makes his performance so compelling is how he balances strength with vulnerability. One minute he's confidently hunting down the infected with military precision, the next he's talking to mannequins in a department store, desperately clinging to the last threads of his sanity. There's this amazing scene where he plays a movie in an empty theater, reciting every line from memory, and you can see the loneliness eating away at him. Heston wasn't just playing an action hero, he was showing us what isolation does to the human mind. Then there's Anthony Zerbe as Matthias, the leader of the family, those nocturnal, plague-infected survivors who reject technology and hunt Neville. Zerbe brings this chilling religious fanaticism to the role. His quiet, measured delivery makes lines like, "We are the family of the dark," feel genuinely unsettling rather than campy. What's fascinating is that Zerbe doesn't play Matthias as a typical villain. He genuinely believes Neville represents the corrupt old world that brought destruction upon humanity. There's conviction behind those milky eyes. But the performance that was truly groundbreaking for 1971 was Rosalind Cash as Lisa. Her character, a fierce, independent survivor who develops a relationship with Neville, represented something rarely seen in mainstream sci-fi of that era. A strong black female lead in an interracial romance with the white male star. Cash brings this wonderful swagger and intelligence to Lisa. She matches Heston's intensity beat for beat, creating a relationship that feels authentic rather than forced. The chemistry between them makes scenes like their impromptu apartment date both tender and believable within this apocalyptic setting. The film's most powerful scenes come from these character interactions. When Neville discovers a group of young survivors hiding in the city, there's this beautiful moment where his face transforms. You literally watch hope return to someone who thought it was gone forever. Or that devastating finale where Heston, wounded and dying, hands over the cure for the plague, his own blood serum, in a pose deliberately reminiscent of Christ on the cross. It's heavy-handed symbolism, sure, but Heston commits to it so completely that it works. Behind the scenes, casting wasn't without its challenges. The studio initially pushed back against Cash's casting, concerned about the interracial relationship, but director Segal and Heston both insisted. It's also worth noting that this was one of the first major films where the apocalypse survivors were a diverse group, rather than the typical all-white ensemble common in earlier sci-fi. This wasn't just progressive casting. It reflected the changing reality of urban America that audiences recognized. What makes these performances stick with you is how they elevate what could have been a standard last man on Earth story into something more profound, a meditation on what makes us human when everything we've built comes crashing down. You know how some movies are just ahead of their time? The Omega Man is definitely one of those films. When it hit theaters back in '71, critics weren't exactly falling over themselves with praise. Vincent Canby from the New York Times called it occasionally interesting, but mostly silly. Ouch. The film got this lukewarm reception, not terrible, not great, with many reviewers dismissing it as just another sci-fi B-movie riding on Charlton Heston's star power. But here's the thing about the Omega Man. It's aged like fine wine. Over the decades, what audiences and critics once saw as flaws have transformed into strengths. That heavy-handed social commentary? Now it seems prophetic. Those religious undertones that some found too obvious? They've taken on new layers of meaning in our increasingly divided world. The film was controversial in its day for reasons that seem almost quaint now. Some religious groups were upset about the Christ-like imagery of Neville's sacrifice. Others were uncomfortable with the interracial relationship between Heston and Cash, something that barely raises an eyebrow today, but was genuinely boundary-pushing for mainstream cinema in 1971. There's this fascinating shift in how people watch the movie now compared to then. In the 70s, viewers focused on the action elements. Heston shooting it out with the plague victims, those chase sequences through abandoned buildings. Today's audiences are more likely to connect with the psychological aspects, the loneliness, the breakdown of society, the conflict between science and belief. It's like we're watching the same film but seeing completely different movies. I stumbled across some fascinating details about the Omega Man that most people don't know. For instance, the screenplay was actually co-written by John and Joyce Corrington, a husband and wife team who brought in many of the religious elements. Joyce had a background in theology, which explains why the conflict between Neville and the family has such strong biblical undertones. Another hidden gem, there was a deleted scene where Neville visits his wife's grave that was cut from the final film. It would have revealed more about his life before the plague, but the filmmakers decided to keep his past more mysterious. Sometimes what's left unsaid hits harder than exposition. And get this, the film's unique look wasn't just an artistic choice, but partly a necessity. When shooting those daytime scenes, they had limited time to keep the streets clear of traffic and pedestrians. So cinematographer Russell Meddy deliberately overexposed many shots to create that bleached-out look. A technical limitation became one of the film's most distinctive visual signatures. The evolution of the Omega Man from commercial sci-fi thriller to cultural touchstone wasn't overnight. It gained traction through television broadcasts throughout the 70s and 80s, developing that passionate cult following that kept it alive when many of its contemporaries faded into obscurity. By the time DVD collections came around in the early 2000s, it had secured its place in the apocalyptic film canon, not just as an adaptation of I Am Legend, but as its own unique vision of the end times. What I find most fascinating is how a film that was once considered somewhat derivative has itself become a blueprint that later filmmakers return to again and again. That's not just evolution, that's cinematic immortality. The Omega Man might be over 50 years old now, but its DNA is all over modern post-apocalyptic stories. You can't watch something like 28 Days Later without seeing the influence. That opening sequence of Cillian Murphy wandering through empty London streets, pure Omega Man energy. When Will Smith starred in the direct remake I Am Legend in 2007, they had all the CGI technology in the world, but they still couldn't quite capture the eerie authenticity of those deserted Los Angeles streets from the original. What's really striking is how many of the film's themes feel even more relevant today than they did back in 1971. The idea of a man-made plague decimating civilization? That hits differently after COVID. The conflict between science and faith-based fanaticism? Just check your newsfeed. Even Neville's fortress apartment with its elaborate security systems feels like a precursor to our modern prepper culture. The film's exploration of isolation has taken on new meaning too. There's this scene where Neville sits alone in his apartment, surrounded by technology but desperate for human connection. It feels like a perfect metaphor for our social media age, where we can be constantly connected, yet profoundly alone. What makes the Omega Man matter today isn't just its prophetic themes, but how it approaches them. Unlike many modern apocalyptic stories that revel in doom and gloom, there's a stubborn hopefulness at its core. Despite everything he's lost, Neville keeps fighting, keeps searching for a cure, keeps trying to rebuild something resembling civilization. When he discovers other survivors, particularly the young people, the film becomes less about the end of the world and more about the possibility of a new beginning. Culturally, the film stands as an important marker in how science fiction addresses race in America. The relationship between Neville and Lisa wasn't just progressive for its time, it offered a vision of post-apocalyptic society where the old racial divisions might be transcended. In a genre that often defaulted to predominantly white casts, the Omega Man suggested diversity wasn't just a social good, but a survival necessity. The film's visual language has left its mark too. That stark contrast between sterile daylight and threatening darkness has become a standard technique in post-apocalyptic storytelling. Shows like The Walking Dead and The Last of Us use similar visual cues to distinguish between safe zones and dangerous territory. Even the wardrobe of the family, those dark robes and hoods, has influenced countless depictions of post-collapse cults and communities. What ultimately gives the Omega Man its lasting power isn't the special effects or even the performances, impressive as they are. It's the film's understanding that apocalypse stories aren't really about the end of the world. They're about what we value most when everything else is stripped away. Through Neville's journey from isolated survivor to potential savior, the film suggests that community, connection, and compassion are what make us truly human, not our technology, our buildings, or our possessions. In a world that sometimes feels like it's teetering on the edge of its own apocalypse, maybe that's why we keep returning to stories like the Omega Man. They remind us that even after the worst happens, there's still possibility, there's still hope, and maybe, just maybe, there's still a future worth fighting for. So what's your favorite apocalyptic film? Does the Omega Man still rank among the classics for you? Let me know in the comments, and if you enjoyed this breakdown, hit that subscribe button for more deep dives into sci-fi cinema that shaped our imagination. Until next time, stay human.